Welcome to the Happy Fools podcast. I'm your co host, Trevor, broadcasting from the dusty storage area underneath my dining room, joined again by Peter. Peter, how are you, man?
I'm very well, thank you, Trevor. It's a pleasure to speak to you again.
Yes, that was a beautiful intro. I think last time I introduced you right as you were taking a sip of water.
Oh yeah, I had a near-death experience.
Oh, it was an NDE right when we started. It was awesome. Speaking of your last episode, I was up in Oregon last time we talked,
That's right, yeah.
and it was such a nice interview, man. It was fascinating. It was so interesting. My legs were numb by the time the interview was done because I was sitting on the floor, but I didn't want the conversation to end. And so this is kind of a tough ask of me, but for folks who didn't see that, could you kind of try to summarize what we talked about?
Um, to be honest, we were going to do this a bit sooner, and my memory's completely gone. I mean, I
I
assume it was about King Arthur, but
There's it had something to do with King Arthur. I'm
yeah,
pretty
right,
sure.
okay. So
No,
I think
I'll tell you because I remember.
go on. Yeah, if you've got a
Uh,
fresh memory, go on. That's it.
so, well, at least the part that was, I'm fascinated by stuff that I am shocked that I have no knowledge of. As a grown man,
Mm,
I hear things and I'm like, I should know this because I'm a man who lives in a world, a real place. I have a functioning brain. I went to public school. Well, maybe that's the problem, but I went to school. I should know this. And I realized I knew absolutely nothing about the ancient history of Britain. And I
mm.
didn't even know what that word really meant and what it meant versus England and, the Saxons, the English, the Anglican, like all of these words that to me all just meant that you had an English accent.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You gave me like a whirlwind tour of the history of your country, which I thought was really cool because I love history. So I don't know if you want to try to.
Yeah,
It's not really
fill in
something
some
you can do
gaps.
briefly, but for folks who didn't see that, maybe give them a
Yeah,
reason why to go
sure.
back and listen.
So I think that's I think you did a good job there, Trevor. And I think there's I would say that another thing that I tried to make clear was my own surprise when I learned these things, especially as someone who lives in this country, that there was so much that I had no idea existed. And there is no reason. Again, I had a casual interest in history. I have a brain that functions. I went to I had again what we wouldn't call it a public education because in Britain a public education is what you'd call a private education. We call it like a I don't know comprehensive education in
Well,
this
now I
country.
need that explained to me too. What does that even mean?
Um, I think that the idea is that it's owned by a member of the public rather than by the government. So that's
Oh,
possibly
okay. So we
the
use
public
we use the word public to
maybe
mean the exact opposite thing.
opposite. Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
confusing.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay.
But so I had a similar education to yours, so maybe that again, that's the problem. So, but no, this seems to be something which is, it's for people who take an interest in the topic and who dive into it, it can become commonplace knowledge easily. But to someone just being educated in the country, none of this stuff will come up at all.
What would you
Um,
say? What would you say is kind of the common understanding of your country's history?
So I think the key point we're talking about with Arthur is a period after what we would describe as the Roman withdrawal of Britain. So this will be the fifth and sixth centuries AD, and the what we would sort of generally say, and what would you come across on TV, and what you teach any kid in modern England is that immediately after the Romans left, we had tribes coming from the east and the west, from Ireland and from Germany and Scandinavia, um, basically come in and start taking control, start raiding. And this basically eventually led over the centuries to the demise of Britain. Or not the demise, but kind of like the fracturing of the Brythonic areas and the creation of Wales and Cornwall. Um, And the Christianity as well, this is an important point. What they generally say is that Christianity was formalized in England, in southern England, by continental missionaries, and
Okay.
then in the north by Irish missionaries.
Okay.
Okay. Now, they would, so they would teach that at, say, what they call GCSE level here, 16-year-olds. They'd tell someone living in my area, they'd say that Southern England, with Christianity was formalized in around the 600s, right? And they would say it was done by continental missionaries. That's what they'd be taught.
Okay.
Now, 100 years before that, we have people carving granite monuments in our area with crosses on them,
Hmm.
right? So what's going on here?
That's
So
interesting.
this statement that they're teaching children, you can even look at they call it BBC bite size. It's this, it's what they teach to standard, revision for kids of that age. Um, they what they teach them is just patently not true and has never been true. It's never even been the mainstream opinion in this area. Christianity was already thriving in this part of southern England long before these European missionaries came to evangelize the Saxon kings. Um,
Well,
but
that's fascinating because that obviously that points to earlier migration of some Christian groups to England much sooner than we thought. Is this
and
where we
also
get
it's
into?
this idea of well as using the term England, but of course in the term they're talking about England didn't exist, and this part of the country was not, although it is now southern England, and that's how they sort of explain it. It wasn't then. This was Britain, and it was a kingdom possibly called Dumnonia or something similar to that.
Hmm.
And
And
in
Britain is comes from the word Brightons. Is that am I
well, well
the other way around?
so there's a word that's like Pridden, which
Hmm.
is we call Prydain as well, and or Ficti is another word, and it kind of means like painted. So
I remember that now.
one
Okay.
of the ideas is that it's to do with the blue woad, the blue tattoo that
Yeah.
the people would wear on the skin, and this idea of going into battle naked, which I think is preposterous.
Seems like a bad move.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean?
I'm not convinced by that at all, if I'm honest.
Just
Um,
seems a little impractical, but hey, what do I know? Uh,
yeah,
okay, so some of the Hollywood propagandizing I've received in my life is fairly accurate. It sounds like because I've seen blue paint on people. I've seen it.
yeah.
Um,
I
well,
mean, it doesn't mean it
I
wasn't
think
used. I
I
mean,
think
it
Mel
definitely
Gibson
was
had
being
some
used.
blue paint, so that's wrong
Yeah.
because that was a different time period. But um, but I think Britannia there's some blue paint involved. I still need you to watch the Netflix series The Last Kingdom to tell me if anything in it is accurate. But
The Last Kingdom. Is that the Saxon one?
yeah, he's this kid who's half Saxon, half Viking, and he ends up joining the Saxons to make England a unified country
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
against the Danes. You know, it's
Yeah.
uh, it's probably all bullshit, but
Well,
it's
no, no. I mean, this is essentially that the story of the genesis of England. This is what our culture and history is saturated with. But
what
it
that
only
story.
applies. Yeah, yeah. The
Yeah.
general, so they call it the heptarchy before that, which is like the original Saxon kingdoms, which
Yep.
weren't really, cohesive at all when they were warring each other as well
Yeah.
as the Britain.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then there was a big threat from the Vikings and the Danes, as they're generally called in British history. And um, this is what we hear about all the time. But of course, it only applies to certain regions, really within England.
Right.
But this is what we get. If there's a story about British history, it's about English history. It's
Right.
never it's never really about British history.
Man,
Uh,
that really makes sense. I mean, the only context I have, I'm trying to translate this for folks like me who don't have the same like frame of reference that you do growing up in
yeah,
England. For me, it kind of is reminiscent of um, our concept of early America and Native Americans. So the Brightons is that
Britons.
the Britons? Okay,
Yeah,
these were individuals who were there before settlers from Rome and other places came to the island.
yeah,
Is that correct?
yeah. The prehistoric peoples. I mean, people can argue different ways with the DNA. how long certain elements have been there and for how long. Generally, they call the Celtic arrival, like the Latin is around 600 BC, something like that. But then we have the Hallstatt Celts, another 600 years before that. But even then, they're not, these are often referring to material cultures, and they're not really sure
Gotcha.
how much, people's changed. But yeah, essentially, we're talking
So
about
would it be
the Britons being the native population. Yeah.
okay? So it'd be almost fair to call them like these are the indigenous peoples of.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this is quite a good little way to think about it. It there's no real question that as someone born and raised in England, that I have been um, not taught any Irish history because of political reasons.
Oh, interesting.
Especially modern Irish history, of course, but also the ancient stuff and medieval history. That is generally, that it would not be any no one would say, oh yeah, the reason they don't teach English kids, Irish history is it's clearly politics. There's no other reason for it. What's kind of odd is that, and this should, if you've got any Irish listeners, which I imagine you probably do, I know you've definitely got one, Mr. Tweedy. But
Cool.
if you, what they might find odd if they got a little conspiracy guy going, is why me living in modern England can find it easier to find resources, whether they're kind of entry level, simple resources or academic resources on Irish ancient and medieval history than I can on Brythonic ancient history. And
Oh man, that's fascinating. That opens up a lot of interesting like hypotheses in my mind of why that might be the case. I mean, if you wanted to be as boring as possible, which I generally try not to do, but if you want to be as boring as possible, you might say, "Oh, it's just we just don't know as much about that time period." But is that really true? Is that, I mean, I guess it's farther back, so
there's a lot of Irish documentation, and generally, by the mainstream, they treat it as, they don't take a lot of it very seriously, but they do have a lot of documentation in Ireland. They got great, monasteries for recording stuff. But I think the other reason is because that when the Celtic revivals really kicked off in like the 19th century, especially 18th, 19th century, especially, is that because of eventually Irish independence, their kind of Celtic revival kind of kept going. You know,
Mm.
it had a, and it's still going in a way. Um, Whereas I think in Wales and in Scotland, there was a political backlash from England. Um, uh, this can be
This is
actually seen and looked at. I mean, this is very, certain, especially some of the Welsh revivalists were also pacifists, vegetarians, things like that. So they weren't very politically popular in terms of, how powerful people thought of them. Um,
I wonder if that's because this is, would you call it, so is it's at this point, is it more of a culture? Is it more of a, like, is it a genetically determined thing?
so
Are
this
the
is the thing.
Celtic people who have Celtic DNA and ancestry, or because we have an analog for this, it's Native Americans and they
Yeah.
have a very specific genetic makeup. And, here they were almost completely eliminated and there's now reservations. And we kind of like have this like it's not propaganda because it's true, but like our elementary school is like all about the atrocities that were committed in the
Mm.
formation of America. It doesn't, it sounds like it's almost the opposite in England. It's like, well, we don't
Yeah.
really talk about that first sin, or whatever you want to call it. We talk all about these more modern conflicts. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
exact opposite of what I've experienced. So why do you think that I mean, what's the reason?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's going back a long way. So you could
Yeah,
use
remind me
it.
the
We're
time
talking about
period.
over 1,000 years ago. So,
You said
um,
200, you said
but
200.
then actually, well, yeah, this is a very interesting thing because the persecution of like the Welsh use of the Welsh language is something that goes back until very recent history. This is something we can find in quite a shocking way. In the 19th century, there was something called the treachery of the Blue Books. Um, the idea was to send two guys from Parliament in London to go and review the state of Welsh education and to recommend reform. Um, and they did this incredible piece of work, like just thousands and thousands of pages of documentation, where if you look through it, you can see the clear issue is poverty. Like
Mm, hmm.
that's why they have issues in their education system is because of poverty. It's clear for anyone to see reading the documents. And when you get to the conclusions, what it says is, yeah, the Welsh education system is in the right state, and the problem is this horrible language which their immoral mothers are teaching them. So, on their recommendation, overnight, every teacher in Wales was sacked and replaced by a monoglot, an English speaking only teacher.
Oh
And
wow. So this is
yeah,
like
they filled
that's
every
like
Welsh classroom. So you basically that day you would have had, however many Welsh speaking kids. The schools must have been absolutely mental because no one would have understood what anyone was saying to each other.
sounds like an American
Yeah.
school where nobody speaks the language. So there was like a cultural erasure for some
Yeah,
reason. But
absolutely.
now that's not the
In
case.
Cornwall, in Cornwall, they would often refuse to print prayer books in Cornish, and you'd only get them in English. And this actually led to like pretty massive uprisings with involving tens of thousands of people, and often ended in mass executions and things like that. It was pretty horrendous. Um,
Forgive my ignorance, but I know most of my listeners aren't going to know either. Is Cornish it's a language?
yeah,
Welsh
so
is a language. These are two different languages from two different regions in
yeah.
England. Okay.
Um, so we're talking about the western fringes of Britain,
Okay.
essentially.
Okay.
And that sort of bulge in the middle is Wales, and then the bottom promontory is the West Country, and Cornwall is the variant. Oh, cup of tea. Fantastic.
Oh
Uh,
man. Oh nice.
um,
I tried to get my
and-
wife to bring me a coffee, but you're newly married, so I see how this.
yeah, got to make the most of it for now.
Enjoy it while you can.
So at some point, the entire island would have spoken something they call Proto-Brythonic now,
Okay.
or Insular Celtic, or something like that. Um, and um, at some point, these languages started diverging. Now, Cornwall and Brittany in northwestern France, they basically spoke almost an identical language up until about the 12th century AD. And then it started to diverge after that. Welsh started diverging earlier, and the general idea is that those sort of promontories there were at some point connected by land, and then when this point was conquered by the Saxons and it split up the land, this is when the languages started.
Gotcha.
Uh,
Mhm.
I'm not so sure because the water that separates them is negligible, and I think would have been very regularly crossed.
Yeah.
So I'm not so sure about that, but at some point it happened anyway. Then we got into what they call Middle Welsh or Old Welsh, and then Middle Welsh, Old Cornish, and Old Breton. Although, as I say, Old Cornish and Old Breton are so indistinguishable. There's some manuscripts where they're not sure which one it is. Um, they just say it's one or the other, basically.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, as an American, of course, I'm fascinated by English culture because we grew up on it. You know, all of our movies, all of our stuff, all of our Disney. It's all British English. You know, so. But I will say it's fascinating to me the way that um, cultures are developed that are so distinct from one another in such, I would a comparatively small area.
Yeah, yeah,
I could
yeah,
drive 20 hours in one direction and not feel like I'm in a different place. you know,
yeah.
whereas you can go to like different worlds on a bus, you know, so
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the especially like accent can shift so
right.
quickly.
Yep. Yep.
It's pretty. I mean, like the trains were the beginning of the end of that. But
Oh, I'm
and
sure. I'm
I'd say
sure.
now it's going even more. But yeah, you
I
can.
would I would argue that that is the recipe for human flourishing though, is to have like distinct a distinct culture. I mean, I gotta be careful not to make anything political here, but I like being able to go to Texas and have Texas be like, we're all Americans, but it's a different place.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm not trying to make Texas California, although some people are. And Texas isn't trying to make California. It's like, hey, we're all Americans, but it's culturally distinct. It's fun. It makes the
yeah,
world
yeah,
more interesting instead of this like homogenous mass of
absolutely.
whatever. So
And with risk of upsetting some people, the southeast of England is all very similar.
okay.
There's not a lot as you
And
pass
that's for
higher up.
Londonist. That's for Londonist.
Yeah,
South. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. It's a
Yeah,
lot
that
on the
that has a
south coast
tendency
of
to happen.
somewhere.
That has a
Yeah,
tendency to happen with cities. Well, I think you caught me up to the way I remember feeling last time, which is that British and English history is complicated.
yeah.
More complicated than I knew. But I thought of you the other day. I was watching. You're probably tired of me making this reference, but I was watching Clarkson Farm season 4, and he was driving down the street, and he goes, "Do you see that wall over there? That's a Neolithic, Paleolithic wall."
Neolithic woman.
Yeah, and when baby Jesus was born, that wall was 1,000 years old. And I was like, "Oh, this is the kind of stuff my friend Peter is into." What culture was that? That's the
I mean, I don't know what specifically he's talking about.
Yeah. Sorry, you have no frame of
No,
reference.
no, I don't. But I know we've got a lot. I think we were talking a bit about ditches and banks. I think I briefly mentioned ditches and banks. We've got a lot of
Yeah,
ditches and banks
yeah,
in our archaeology. Some of them are fucking great big things, like a
yeah.
couple of miles long, and sometimes it looks like a railway embankment, like the size of it. They're absolutely huge. And we've got miles and miles and miles of these things, possibly built by different people over different times. Some of them are, slightly different design and that. But a lot of them, they don't have a clue who built them.
I love that.
Like they genuinely don't. And a lot of them that so recently there's a couple, one called Offa's which is sort of on the modern border between England and Wales. And is named after this Mercian Saxon king, Mercian king called Offa, and it was it's claimed by some to be a defensive ditch between England and Wales and Mercia, sorry.
Okay.
But sometimes the bank's on the wrong side.
Mm.
Sometimes it's like it skirts around the edge of a cliff, but kind of on the wrong, like it wouldn't really function defensively on either side.
This is
Uh,
now like a trope and a cliche, but somebody needs to hold archaeology accountable, man.
I
It's like,
know,
what are
right?
you guys
They
doing?
there's sections where they've got C14 dates, which are thousands of years older than the early medieval period. There's
No, don't worry about it. It
and like
doesn't.
all of them are like that. All of them have similar stories where it's like, well, we thought it was this old, but then we got much older C14 dates, and then somebody thought it was this, but then we realized that it went under a Roman road or something like that. And yeah, there's loads of them. Like I think there's one called the Devil's Dyke as well, which is actually lots of sections. Um, some of them look like possibly canals,
Oh my God.
ways of shifting stuff, but possibly ancient canals. Um, there's a guy called John Robert Langdon who does a lot on that, which is very interesting.
Not
Um,
not the Robert Langdon from Da Vinci Code.
no,
This is
not. I did a double take, I have to admit. Yeah, so they're weird. I mean,
Well,
goodness.
that's obviously exciting. This is when everyone starts getting excited. Like, what is this part of us, this worldwide civilization, thousands of
Yeah,
years
yeah.
ago, So obviously, I hesitate to go there, but do you have any ideas about how you could
I
have this type of culture there?
This is something that I've only well, like the sort of the great megalithic culture, or is that the
Exactly. Yeah.
well, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if some of these ditches and that is connected to the real Neolithic stuff,
Yeah.
Avebury and the early bits of Stonehenge, and got amazing stone circles all over the islands and Brittany as well. Brittany's got insane, like the biggest standing stones, like the Grand Menhir. It's
Really?
now in three pieces, and I think one of those pieces is like the entire capstone for a huge, like burial chamber thing. Like just one piece of it.
Wow.
It was absolutely massive. and they've got all sorts of stuff like that.
I think France is weak right now. We might try to get Brittany back for you guys. That's what
Well,
I.
you know, it's a lovely place. It's very French though now. Oh no, I'm not
Dang.
gonna
Okay.
upset anyone by saying that.
I don't know a single French person, so don't worry.
It's the Bretons I'm worried about upsetting. I don't think
Oh,
there's
okay.
many native Breton speakers left, unfortunately. They're trying to save the language, but the problem with saving a language often is you have to standardize it, and often these ancient languages survive as a group of dialects.
Oh,
So
interesting.
to standardize,
You
you
kind of
have
have
to
to erase.
massacre it.
Yeah, you have to erase 99% of the
Yeah,
variety to keep
yeah,
it alive.
yeah.
Interesting.
And it's
So
possibly the same with revived Cornish as well. Is not sure how close to source it is, you know.
how I don't want to turn this into like too obscure of a scholarly discussion, but how unique are these languages? Are they just completely someone who speaks English would not have the first clue what it is, or is it related? Like, what's the?
No, the thing is that this one is kind of a hotly debated topic. So there's no there's no argument. English is not a Latin language, but there is a lot of Latin in English. We know
Mhm.
this, right? And a lot of words in English they'll say comes from the Latin, blah, 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 whatever. But often when you look at the Welsh version, Welsh is not a Latin language either, but it has had a lot of Latin influence. You'll
Mm.
see that the Welsh version of that word is a lot more similar to the English word than it is to the Latin word.
Oh, so
So,
English could almost be like a Latinized Welsh. Is that kind of the idea?
or that at least the Latin has come th to English through Welsh
Okay.
rather than directly from Latin.
Okay.
Um, there is also the idea that some people do think that English is the lost Celtic language in some ways, or the language of the Iceni, which are a
You said English. Do you mean Welsh?
no, I mean English.
English. Okay.
So,
Okay.
so some people just
I'm just
so the
making sure I
Iceni,
understood. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So the Iceni inhabited sort of the bulge on the eastern coast of southern England. They were a pre-Roman tribe. Famous for Queen Boudica. Have you heard of her? She
No.
used to be called Boadicea in
Okay.
classical tongue, but now they call her Boudica. She killed like 70,000 Romans, something like that.
Oh, nice.
Um,
Did her
yeah,
part.
we'll get to that in a minute. But sometimes some people have called the language of the Iceni Isinglass, and the idea is that Inglass is actually English. And that's
Mm,
where the word comes from. But again, that's some people's idea. I'm not so sure. There's definitely a Germanic thing in there. But I think so. Tolkien said, uh, what did he say? Something like Welsh is an adminicle to the English language. So Welsh sort of proves how English developed. I think is what he was
mm,
getting at. And he was saying, if you want to be a really, really good scholar of English, you have to know Welsh. Is what his point
interesting.
was. Yeah, if you look at what people generally say about it, your Wikipedia and how people talk about it, very, very rarely do people talk about the Brythonic influence on English. Very rarely.
I'm
But
just fascinated by how much of this is unknown. It's captivating to me, like how little we know about this. I mean, you know a tremendous amount, but there's all. It does sound like ancient history was just so much more complex than we could ever imagine. And
yeah,
like in all forms of science, even the form of science I work in, which is neuroscience, all forms of science, it sounds like archaeology especially, they are endeavoring to present a simple narrative that's easy to understand and concise.
yeah.
And in doing so, it just has to be wrong.
Mhm.
It just has to be completely incorrect, right? And so, wow, that's interesting. Okay.
Can we
So,
can I segue into something?
yeah. I was just
Go on, go on, go on.
I was going to ask you about Welsh and ancient Egyptian, but we'll save that for
No,
later.
no, this is
Oh, okay. Okay.
no, this is actually sort of ancillary to that at least.
Okay, cool.
So,
Let's do it.
so I want to talk about the migrations because that's
Please.
kind of like the beginning of this, and um, we're going to be talking about. possibly Egyptian or Semitic influences in ancient Britain,
Let's do it.
and I'd be called a pseudo historian for talking about that. But you can go to
Hmm.
John Cock and what's the other guy called? Very famous Celtic scholars. They put together the idea of Celts from the West. Barry Cunliffe. Um, they've written about the Afro-Asiatic substrate of Insular Celtic. So me saying there's an Egyptian and Semitic influence on ancient Brythonic languages is pseudo-archaeology, but the archaeologists can say there's an Afro-Asiatic underpinning.
And I swear I'll be brief because I want to go down this road, but this is like a real problem that I think people should be more aware of and address. It's that, you know, archaeologists, whoever they are, can look at this embankment with the wood facing the wrong way and the carbon dating all wrong, and they can come up with a theory that's clearly not supported by evidence. And it's scientific because it's mainstream. You know,
Mm,
it's the right credentialed people and groups said it is what it is, so therefore it's scientific. Whereas you might present ideas with evidence, a well-formed hypothesis with supporting evidence, an acknowledgement that it might not be true, but it also could be because here's why. And that's labeled pseudoscientific. And now I think a objective, logical person would look at those two ways of reasoning and rationalizing and say that the one you employed is much more scientific, like from a methodological perspective, right? Like to just come up with a narrative and make things fit it, that's kind of like the opposite. That
yeah,
is pseudoscientific, right?
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
man, I get so frustrated with
Something
this.
like is it the culture and the tone and the language? If you present something in the certain tone and language, anyone will be like, "Oh yes, yes, great, yes,
Oh
yes."
yes, yeah,
You present it, because you don't know that language, because you haven't been raised in that environment, and you say, "Oh well, here are my ideas," and they go, "Oh well, no, you've used the wrong tone and you've used the wrong language. You can't join
yeah.
our club," you
Yeah,
know.
and folks, like if it sounds like we're just complaining, like I I work in mainstream academic research, and what Peter just said could not be more true because I know it because I do it. I like,
Mm,
we have a word that I'm starting to learn what it means here in politics called code switching. And then
mm,
it's like you kind of switch your mannerisms and the way you talk to fit in with like a lot of times politicians will do it with, like ethnic minorities, right?
mm.
They'll be talking to minorities and they'll kind of switch their mannerisms and stuff. And it's kind of shameful, you know? It's like, what are you doing? Just be yourself, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
scientists do that. You get in a room with a bunch of scientists for grant review or whatever, and everything is kind of serious and measured. And it's like, dude, a second ago, I was just talking to you about, you got drunk last weekend and blah, 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 blah. But you walk in this room with your peers and it's like, well, I suspect that blah, 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 blah. And so it's true. It's about fitting in.
Mm.
Mainstream science is about fitting in. That is what's the Star Trek word? The
Oh, the prime directive.
prime
Yeah, yeah,
directive is like you
yeah,
just do what you need to do to fit in. And the second you start saying stuff like you're saying, if that's not ordained by the like clergy of science, you're in trouble, man. So fortunately for you, though, you can't get kicked out of the club. So you don't have to
yeah.
be as careful as I do. So,
I
but
can
we're not
only
talking about
imagine.
neuroscience, so I can say whatever I want. So let's do it.
So, am I able to just share something for those who do watch?
Yes, please. Sorry for my
No,
rant, everybody. It upsets me. I get triggered.
sharing is not turned on.
Oh, let me address that right now. I
Very
need
much.
to
It's
say
just quickly to have a look at a paper that's come out pretty
you
recently.
you
Or just
should be
well, a
good.
look at it. I mean, scan it. Okay, great, thank you. Ba, ba, ba. There we go.
Have you presented any of these ideas in context where you do kind of get that accusation, or are you like, have you?
The closest some people have. Mentioned briefly the channel Britain's Hidden History, and
Yeah.
sometimes that gets a bit of a label for the pseudo history and that.
Is there
Uh,
something in particular that seems to bother the great algorithm in the sky that manages this stuff?
um, Is there anything in particular? What's the
Like,
thing that
is it the Egypt and the Welsh? Is it the Britons? Is it the?
I mean, there's bits of it. Where am I going? Sorry. Hold on. Sorry, let me concentrate a minute. Sorry.
I'll stop distracting you.
Project 8 and 10. This isn't it. Can that move somewhere else? No. Okay.
Is
Where is
Durham a university in England?
it? It is. Oh,
Okay.
this is the one we want. Here we go. Sorry about that interruption.
The more I learn about England and Britain, the more I realize everything in America is just named after English stuff.
Yeah.
Because we have a Durham as well.
No, right, yeah. Oh, I live near Plymouth, which you might have heard of.
Oh, yep. We got a few of those.
Yeah. You can see the Mayflower steps, or at least you can see the recreated ones, because apparently the real ones are in a club toilet somewhere.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, they're
Just a
probably not too
little
happy.
bit of local knowledge there for you.
Probably not too happy about that boat.
Right. So here we go. So from Land's End to the Levant, did Britain's tin sources transform the Bronze Age in Europe and the Mediterranean?
Here
So
we go. This is exciting. Okay.
yeah, so this is something that's been, I mean, you can find antiquarians talking about this 150 years ago that uh, Phoenicians, that that would always be the classic trader, isn't it? The Phoenicians would come to the West Country and buy tin, and that fueled the Mediterranean Bronze Age. Um, it kind of went out of fashion because the so, as you like to call it, the great algorithm in the sky did not like the idea of a Middle Eastern influence in Britain because there is, we mentioned briefly the 10 tribes. There is an idea. This is something that does anger people. Is the idea of if there's a Semitic influence in Britain. Obviously, it is a touchy subject for lots of people, so I do understand why. But I'm
You
interested in it purely because of how it appears in the history and the archaeology. Not for any. This is ancient history. It doesn't really. I
can
don't
you
think
help
about
me? Can
it
you help me
politically.
understand? I don't want to get you in hot water, but can you help me
No, no, no,
understand
sure.
why that would be controversial?
There was a movement in the 19th century called British Israelism,
Okay.
and they, you know, some kind of misguided to unpleasant things happened as a result of British Israelism. I mean, just from a purely archaeological basis,
Okay.
we would have ancient monuments which they'd go and break into to find the bodies of the prophets.
Okay.
Um, and it was basically vandalism, now those monuments
Some
have been
light grave
abroad.
robbing.
Yeah, I mean, but of ancient monuments as well. So this
Okay.
is, that, and that's just a sort of on the light end of it. But so a lot of people immediately, whenever they see anything about Middle Eastern or Semitic influence in Britain in ancient
Got
periods,
it.
they
Got it.
immediately jump to British Israelism.
Got it.
Um, but a lot of the influence of where the texts that British Israelists looked at came from long before the movement. These are things that have been written about in some way or another for hundreds, if not thousands of years,
Okay.
um, or 1,000 years maybe. So yeah, and that's why I'm interested in it. And we have symbols, we have um, uh, writing styles, letter styles, artifacts of Middle Eastern style, all these sorts of things, names which are possibly related to Phoenician names. There's all
It's
sorts of things.
fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, there's loads of great stuff, and a lot of it does balance on the end of pseudo archaeology and all this, but some of it is really interesting. But
Well, I mean, you can.
now
It's
we
okay
have
to
chemical.
speculate.
Sorry.
I was just sorry. I was just gonna say it's okay to speculate
Oh,
sometimes. You know?
absolutely, absolutely. I totally agree. But now we have some chemical evidence that
Oh, perfect.
what what they're they've looked at a lot of shipwrecks. So here we go, off the coast of Israel and southern France. They've looked at tin ingots found off the coast of Britain. They've compared them to ingots from various other tin sources. So in central France, Central Asia, Iberia, and it's looking at like the majority of the tin. came from southwestern Britain. So
Okay, sorry. Let me back up. So the shipwrecks are in the Middle East, in the Levant.
some of them are, yeah, from a
And the
spread of time.
tin
Some of them are some of them are medieval, some of them are ancient. Like
and the tin
modern
came
day.
from Britain.
Yeah.
How I mean, listen, I know you're not a geologist or whatever, but how do they know this? So
So
they
I'm
must have
thinking that we
some
can have
type
a
of
look at
process.
this. I think there's an
It's so
image.
cool.
Um,
How
it,
pseudoscientific of you to be presenting a peer-reviewed, well-cited paper to make your point clear.
I'm not sure if we've got the image here, but it's to do with I think
There
so. It's
must be like
isotope
certain
analysis.
there
It's
must be
isotope analysis.
certain oh, isotope. Wow. So
Yeah,
this is incredibly robust. This is not
yeah,
just like this is, this ratio of these metals is typical of a, medieval. No, no, no. This is as sophisticated as you can get. Isotopes. Wow. Very
yeah.
cool.
Because tin as well is you find it with granite, and obviously the granite has a very distinctive radioactive uh, element to it. I mean, it's constantly pissing out radon gas for one. Um,
This seems difficult to dispute.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And the paper is great because at the end they say we need to rethink what's going on in this place at this time because if these people were dealing with what we call the advanced um, cultures of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Phoenicians, Egyptians, then we should expect to see that cultural influence here. I mean, the Israel ingots are stamped with marks, and this is a time where Britain is illiterate. So um, who's making those marks, and what do they mean? It's very interesting. So this is interesting. So this at the bottom here, these are wooden Bronze Age artifacts preserved in streaming deposits. A streaming deposit is where you mine the alluvial tin in the riverbed, and basically you cover it. You're constantly moving pebbles and rocks and dirt around to find the tin ore. Um, we've got tin artifacts, we've got tin working tools, tin slag, um, all sorts. On the right here is Dartmoor. I live on this bit here, and we have 1600 BC tin necklace found. Um, yeah, there's loads of evidence now, and as I say, the isotope stuff's really bringing this up. But the really interesting thing is how bronze spread in Europe. So it was kind of slowly marching from the Mediterranean towards Western Europe, Northwestern Europe, very, very slowly. And then suddenly, in around 2000 BC, there's suddenly a bit of a surge in metalworking in Britain, right? And then suddenly in 1600 BC, 1700 BC, there's what they've coined the term bronzization, not bronzification, which is much
Hmm.
easier to say, but bronzization they've called it, where literally exploding out of Western Britain is this tin bronze working technology, which literally, as I say, explodes out of Western Britain and goes right across Western Europe and down east before that slow eastern march makes its way to Western Europe, basically.
Are
So it's
these
like
metals not present in the Levant?
right. So copper is abundant in quite
Okay.
a lot of places, right?
Okay.
Tin is difficult. Tin is very rare. Okay. Um, Also, the other thing about tin is like how close to the surface, how easy is it to get to? So the West Country is interesting because although geographically it's kind of a small area, the accessibility of the tin and the quality of the tin is amazing and it's abundant as well. It's kind of like we're just at the right point of geographical time for that tin to be somewhere easy for us to get to it. We've had enough weathering of millions of years on this, there would have been a mountain range, and then it works its way down to the metamorphic plug, which is the granite, and then that wears down, and then that disseminates the tin into the riverbanks where it can then be really easily exploited. Um, so we've got these really abundant, really high quality, and really accessible tin deposits in the West Country. So for anyone who wants lots of tin, and that's the interesting thing about this 1700 BC is that's the tin bronze. So before people were using like arsenified copper or
Hmm.
what's the other thing they mix with it? Can't remember now, but some other metals. But arsenic's the classic one, maybe lead as well. Um,
Oh, and that makes some cups out of it. It'll be
that makes
perfect.
something they call bronze as well, but it's not quite as good. But the 20% tin bronze, that's the good shit, you know.
So
And
could it be that individuals, because at these time periods, the Levant, this is kind of like one of the heights of civilization, right? This area.
yeah, yeah.
So is it possible that they were sending, maybe this is the argument, that they were sending expeditions into this area to mine tin?
Yeah, so that's one
Okay.
thing that antiquarians certainly thought is they'd have prospectors on boats. And one of the good places to, because you can, in Cornwall in particular, you've got the coast wears away the granite. So from a ship, you'd be able, a good prospector would be able to look at the rocks on the coast and to go, I think there's tin here.
Nice.
Um, and in fact, some of them are even the later 19th century Cornish tin mines. They go, they're right on the coast. They go down underground and then they go under the sea,
Oh
looking
my
for the
gosh.
tin load. It's absolutely incredible. But that underground mining didn't come till a lot later. You could literally just get it from the side of a riverbed for ages because there was just so much of it. Um,
Well,
now,
you have, I mean, there's got to be, it sounds like that's the only explanation, is that people were coming to this area from the Levant.
so
They go that far, or are they more reserved in the paper?
yeah, they're pretty reserved. I mean, as I
Okay.
say, they like maybe Iberia, and of course, Iberia has connections to the Levant. So
Well, it's the
if
same
they,
thing. Yeah.
yeah. But let's get to the history
Okay.
because in some texts, so there's something a text called the Brute of England, or sometimes the Prose Brute, and you can also find this story in poetic form, but it's a late story. We're talking this is a late medieval story, but it tells of a princess called Albine, and Albine is the daughter of a very powerful um, king of Assyria. Um,
Hmm.
Sometimes she's the daughter of a Greek king, but basically, there's some shenanigans involving being married off to husbands, which they don't think are good enough, and killing the husbands and all this sort of stuff. But
Got to do what
basically,
you got to do.
Albine then buggers off to Britain. Basically, she takes a big group with her, and she then is the progenitress for a race of giants. Is how it goes because
Let's go.
yeah. So there's also a really complimentary Welsh story. It's about a big white pig. But there's some really interesting similarities to the Albine story. Um, it arrives in the West Country. It's got this name that resembles whiteness because Albine is meant to be related to Albion, this very romantic name for Britain.
Okay.
Um, and also the swine is a progenitor of giant monsters. So there's some interesting links there. We've got a Welsh and an English version of it, but it basically tells of a big influence from the Mediterranean Middle East around 1600, 1700 BC.
Wow. Early. Wow, that is so
Yeah.
early.
Which is exactly the time which they talk about this explosion of bronzization happening from the West Country.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why that's. I mean, listen, you're being clear that this is like a speculative idea, but it's one
Yeah.
based on really
So if so
bust
the
evidence. So it's interesting, fascinating.
Yeah, so the problem with the dating of Albine, because this is a lot, so the authors who have come to those sorts of dates, they've done it by looking at what some people would say very dodgy documents of king lists, which
Okay.
basically go back to this period. So it's just plain old mathematics like they used to do with working out any date in history. How many kings have reigned in this period? What's the average length of a reign? You know, does it fit in with other things they know? So a couple of independent authors have come to this 1600 BC date. The mainstream would just say it's a complete fiction. It's a it's to do with eponymy. You know, how do we explain the name Albion? Oh well, we'll just introduce this Princess Albine. That's,
Mm.
it's a late medieval story. Not interested. But then there's all this other stuff going on. And now this evidence we have today, which is absolutely amazing.
Do we have
Um,
any idea when this? Because I mean, you kind of have to believe that because I'm assuming this journey is not trivial, right? It's a
no,
pretty vast distance. There must be some sort of trade routes and networks and you know places to stop and
mm,
there's got to be some sort of network for accomplishing this goal,
yeah.
right? There has to be some
Well,
kind of routes.
some people who are interested in this story, there's a big discussion of, is it a sea or is it an overland route?
Oh,
You know,
interesting. Okay.
did they come up through Turkey and Macedonia and then across Europe and over the Channel, or is it all the way through the Mediterranean, through the Pillars of Hercules and up the western coast? Um, and people who are into that spend a lot of time thinking about that. I don't really have an opinion either way.
Do we have any idea when this would might have stopped? When tin mining might have stopped, or has
Well,
it been pretty?
the tin mining continued for thousands of years, but
Okay.
these trade wood networks clearly stayed in place for a very long time. And I think we talked a little bit last time about the Mediterranean imports in the Arthurian period, that
Yeah.
they were getting Byzantine pottery and glassware and things like that. So these could be trade routes which have existed for a very, very, very long time.
And then eventually the native Britons kind of took over the mining and processing for themselves eventually.
Yeah, so what that influence, whether it was a conquest, whether it was a a how it functioned, how the Semitic and how the Middle Eastern Levantine influence manifested in Britain, I have no idea. I mean, the history suggests that Albine became the de facto ruler, and her progeny became, the line of kings afterwards. But
So cool.
who know what actually happened?
Yeah.
It's a fascinating idea. Locally as well, it's really interesting because although the moor was used for um, monuments, stone rows, stone circles, during the early Bronze Age here. We don't have a lot of evidence of them living. They probably lived in wooden buildings and stuff, and because it's a granite moorland, wooden artifacts do not survive.
Yeah.
This is something very hard to find. But in this 1600 BC period, they start suddenly people start building stone houses.
Oh,
Um,
now we're getting to the Neolithic. Some of
well,
the ideas
yeah,
came from them.
it's suddenly like, it's like suddenly like, all right, we're moving away from a this is a spiritual landscape to this is a very functional landscape. That's what I see. We also had, talking about big walls and stuff, we've got miles of very low granite walls they call reeves. And these will date to the same period around the Middle Bronze Age, middle to late Bronze Age. Um, and they're parts of what look like massive agricultural systems. Now, I don't think you build massive agricultural systems for scattered pastoralist farmers. You
But
know,
you might for large mining endeavors.
large mining groups, absolutely, yeah. Um, and those Mediterranean tin trading cultures, like the neuralgic culture, is one of them. They live in these awesome round stone towers, and stone building was really important for them. And yeah, suddenly I think we've got 5,000 remaining granite roundhouses on the mall. Some of
Oh,
them are up to 10 to 15 meters in diameter. The walls are a meter thick and probably up to about a meter and a half high. Um, they built them using massive unworked granite blocks. They'd lay them out like, inside and outside would be laid like a curb, so they'd have a flat one and then another one sat on top. and they'd be faced inside and out, and then filled with soil and rubble. And it's not like it's not like Peruvian stonework. It's not high technology
Right,
stuff.
right.
You can tell
Cyclopean.
that you can yeah. I mean it fits on the rougher end of Cyclopean maybe in places, but it's it's nice work and it pops out of nowhere and in a big way, and
Oh,
that
cool.
makes me think that there's some sort of technology introduction or cultural.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain things that demand an explanation. And if there is no mainstream explanation, I don't think it's pseudoscientific to use evidence to
Well,
speculate. I mean, this makes
if
sense.
they're not interested in
Right.
investigating it, so why can't we? Like,
Exactly. Yeah.
they've
This
got
is
their own things they want to look at. They want to look at soil samples of what crops people are growing and things. That I want to
right.
look at I want to look at their massive granite walls and things like that.
Yeah,
Um,
it is. There is some weird, like, cultural, spiritual ethic in archaeology that doesn't like this stuff for some reason. I don't get it. I'm with you. So, now speaking of things archaeologists don't like, one of the reasons why this is so cool is it kind of sets a precedent for people coming to Britain from the Levant at
yeah.
later time periods. It's because it sounds like we have these well-established trade routes, and maybe there's a culture of seafaring that everyone's very aware of this place. You can go out of the reach of the Roman Empire,
Mm.
far away. So it does kind of set this precedent for maybe there being a lot more of this over time, which kind of
Absolutely.
makes sense. I mean, what's
So
problematic about
we
that?
got the next migration.
Yeah,
So actually, can we just take a couple of minutes break? Is that all right, Trevor?
yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
I just need to pop to the loo a second.
Yeah, sounds
Sorry.
good. No, no worries.
Nice one. Thank you.
All right, we're back. Peter's been drinking too much flat brown beer that's room temperature, so he had to leave
The
us.
hot leaf water.
That's
I love
something
my coffee.
Freeman Jack in the Snake Brothers Discord told me is that beer is supposed to be brown, it's supposed to be flat, and it's supposed to be warm, which I could not disagree more forcibly with, but I'll take.
Uh,
Is that
I
is
don't
that
entirely agree with him, but he's got some
Oh,
good
really? So there's
points.
there is some debate. Okay, okay, good. You got to give.
I'm not going to go any further because I will be in trouble. So,
Okay,
um,
okay.
uh, we're on for a second migration.
Yes.
So, I mentioned the founding story of Britain last time, Brutus of Troy. So, in
This is like the official founding story, would you say?
well, yeah. So the Albine story is something that kind of comes later, and I mean, maybe because it's so steeped in antiquity, it's just sort of only come to us as a scrap. But the big one, the famous story, is of Brutus. So Brutus is first appears in Nennius. This is a 9th century AD history. Um, it's found near the beginning, although Nennius is like a compilation, so it's clearly like a selection of texts to be put together. So there's kind of actually like I think two or maybe three founding stories in here. One of them's a bit more classic, it's like the sons of Noah,
Okay.
the that sort of thing. And then the next one is of Brutus. Brutus is said to be a descendant of Aeneas, who fled Troy. I think he was carrying his father out of the fires.
When was the siege of Troy? What?
Uh, well, that was the big question we left out
Because
unanswered.
it used to be never, right? It never
It used
happened.
to be never, yeah, it used to be never. At the moment, they go with 12. Some people 1100 BC, sometimes 1300 BC, but around 1200 BC.
Okay, okay.
Um, So I'm not going to go into like the dating of Troy, but I will talk
Yep.
about some interesting things that happened after a certain period. So
Okay.
let's say after 700 BC, um, we get something happen in Etruria, which is in northeastern or northern Italy. Um, and what we have is they used to call it the Etruscan Orientalizing period. Um, I don't know if they still call it that. So well, they used to call the people before that the Villanovans, and then they would call them Etruscans after this Orientalizing period. Now they just call them all Etruscans for some reason. I'm not sure
Okay.
why. They don't differentiate. But if anyone here has any sort of knowledge of stuff they've seen Etruscan artifacts before or something, that very distinctive style, that's after the Orientalizing period. It's not before. That Villanovan stuff has a very different look to it. The Orientalizing period is typified by a hugely Middle Eastern Semitic influence
Okay.
on art and on culture and things like that, and the use of the straight stroke lettering, which is very similar to Phoenician or the reconstructed Phoenician, and ancient Hebrew, stuff like that. Um, then we've got about 100 years later, um, we've got one of the events that we can possibly call the founding of Rome. So the problem with the founding of Rome is that you've got the little wooden town, like the original settlement, then you've got the first wooden town, then you've got like the first stone buildings on the Palatine Hill, and then you've got, another renovation. So it's like when are you talking about the founding of Rome? Which of these events are you actually talking about in particular? So when did Aeneas come from Troy and found Rome? Which one is he talking about? Now, we're not really sure about that, but certainly sometime around this Orientalizing period, not long after, Rome has one of its steps forward in towards becoming a bigger city, right? Okay. Now, what's interesting about Nennius's account is that he didn't just name any old Brutus. He says exactly what Brutus he's talking about. And this is someone we can find in Roman records. He is the first consul of Rome. So when the Romans got sick of having kings, they had Etruscan kings. They had a bit of a little revolution, and they had some people elected, basically. And the first consul was a guy called Brutus, and he was of Etruscan royalty, right? Um, he has several run-ins with his family, and in the Roman records, he dies. In
Okay.
the British records, he gets banished and he goes to Greece and he travels around the Mediterranean. And after a series of adventures or whatever, he basically gets together a load of Trojan refugees, right, who have for the last 100 years or so been camped out in various places, but generally not doing very well. They are refugees
Okay.
essentially, and he gets them all together and says, "I'm going to take you somewhere nice." And
I hope you
they,
like rain.
yeah, yeah, and they do a little sail around. There's a bit of prophecy involved, all this sort of stuff, and eventually they come to the west coast of France,
Okay.
and they sail up the rivers and they're sort of scavenging, trying to find some food and things like that. And the local king is not too impressed by this group of people turning up. So some fights ensue, and the Trojans win, and they establish themselves in upriver in central France.
Man,
And then,
France even back then couldn't win.
yeah,
Couldn't win.
couldn't win, I know. And then after they're there for a bit, and then they go to Britain, and Brutus conquers Britain, takes over Britain.
Wow.
Now, what's really interesting
Now
as well,
conquers Britain,
from the
conquers
giants.
some from the Giants. Okay, got it.
Yes, absolutely, from the giants. Or sometimes he comes to an empty land, and sometimes he comes and he fights giants. Or he comes to an empty land, but there happens to be a giant there that needs wrestling as well. But we'll get to that, the wrestling in a minute. Wrestling's fun though. Uh,
Sometimes you got to wrestle a giant. I get
Sometimes
it.
you got to wrestle. But what's really interesting is again, we've seen this archaeological change in Etruria, the Orientalizing period, and we've moved forward a couple of 100 years to the time of Brutus, right? And then roughly towards around the end of this time of Brutus, we have what's called the Latin Celtic cultural shift, right?
Okay.
And
Give me a
this
time range. I'm always
So
struggling
about
to.
500, 600 BC. So we're
Okay.
talking we're talking within the same couple of centuries after, all this stuff happening in Etruria and then in Rome, and then
Okay.
suddenly Latin explodes up river in France or in Switzerland today, right? And it starts happening in Latin, and then it suddenly explodes in Britain before
Okay.
then spreading
Okay.
throughout Europe. Latin is typified by Etruscan design.
Oh, all right.
Okay, it's a real curious mix of uh, Levantine, Etruscan, and Celtic styles. We suddenly get chariot burials, which are very classically Etruscan. You get these big ornate cauldrons with Etruscan faces on and things like that. So we've got this really nice sort of st story, which goes from Troy to Etruria to Rome to Britain, and we can, or from via France, and we can kind of follow that in the archaeology as this Etruscan style, comes from the east into Italy and then suddenly explodes in northwestern Europe.
Wow.
Yeah,
Man. Okay. I'm sold. You've convinced me.
it's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this kind of links back to the tin because of the wrestling. So one of Brutus's sort of first lieutenants is called Coroneus. Now his name might be linked to Cernunnos, the horned god. Not quite sure on that one. It's a really interesting idea though. But Coroneus arrives and he wants the West Country where the tin is, right? And this is where we get the name Cornwall. Apparently, it's from Coroneus. But there's a
Hmm.
giant who doesn't like this idea. So Coroneus wrestles the giant, and Coroneus is he's a big bloke, right? So he manages to succeed, and he chucks the giant off the cliff onto the floor, and there's a lot of blood and stuff like that. But then Coroneus becomes the king or the Duke of Western Britain. Um, and in Plymouth, not too far away from the Mayflower Steps, is one place known as Gog Magog's Leap, because the giant was called Gog Magog, and apparently he was thrown off this cliff in Plymouth. Although there's several other places which also claim to be
The giant was called Gog Magog.
Gog
Interesting.
Magog. Yeah, just it's from the Bible. There's also a
Right.
place in eastern England called the Gog Magog Hills as well, which is
I thought
very weird.
Magog was Russia in the end times ideas. Have you heard that? Sorry. Big change.
I
I
mean,
always thought Gog Magog had something to do with Revelation. I didn't realize it was
yeah,
like a
yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
It is from there. There doesn't seem to be. I mean, I looked at this quite a while ago, but I can't see any like cognitive because I think it's Gog and Magog in the
Right.
Bible as well, like
Like
two separate.
one's a place and one's a people was my
Yeah,
interpretation.
that's right. But yeah, he's just called Gog Magog in
Okay.
in in
Gotcha.
in Bru- and I can think of. I feel like someone chose that name
Right.
for a reason and a meaning, and
Feels
I can't
symbolic.
quite work out. Yeah, absolutely. But what essentially they were getting at, I don't know.
Yeah. Who knows? Anyway, sorry to
Yeah.
be out there, but
No, no,
yeah,
no.
wow.
It's a really interesting thing. I mean,
As far as origin stories go, kicking a giant's ass is a good one. That's a good way to become
exactly.
a
Yeah, yeah,
duke, you know? That's
yeah.
pretty that does kind of sound like something
Absolutely.
you make up and tell your friends. I'm not gonna lie, but I believe it. I believe it.
Um, yeah, so that's Brutus's arrival in Britain. He was said to arrive actually on this map here. So on the east coast, there's a river here called the Dart. He was meant to sail up here and first land at a place called Totnes. Um, but again, this is something that's treated like a medieval fable.
Yeah.
Again, Brutus's name can be linked to Britain, so they're like, oh, it's just an example of eponymy, and they want to claim that they're Trojans to link themselves to the classical world, etc., etc.
I can understand making the argument that like, oh, maybe we don't know this is true, but is it the historical accounts that's really the evidence for this event occurring? I mean,
Yeah.
that's
I
pretty
mean, we have these
reasonable
material, we have
starting
this
point.
Etruscan influence,
Yeah.
but they firstly they have to accept that there was a Trojan influence on Etruria.
Okay.
Um, which again, some people say, oh, there's definitely Turkish DNA, and some people say, oh no, there's definitely not Turkish DNA in Etruria. It's a real contested subject that, and then you've got to say, well, then Brutus came to Britain, and Brutus was this guy, and also that ultimately comes back to, well, when was the Trojan War, which is a whole other argument.
Yeah.
So
I think there is, I think people feel like the safe thing is to just deny these ideas, but you denying, like you're saying, this influence, which is clear and obvious. That's like a that's a you're committing to something. Like you're committing to an idea without evidence when you do that. So I think no matter what, it sounds like we don't know. So the fact that we have this historical account that explains observations we see in the art and the culture, I think that's so compelling.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It doesn't have to mean that a guy called Brutus led them,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
and you don't have to take all that stuff with it. But there is as you say, a really compelling link there, I think.
And this
Uh,
would have been a couple hundred years before we get to maybe a guy named Arthur.
well, we're about 500 years before we get a guy called Julius Caesar,
Oh, okay, okay, okay. Gotcha.
right?
Gotcha.
So that will be the next big shift in
Okay.
things. Is Julius Caesar arrival. And we talked about, and there's another big shift that could happen around the same time, which is possibly the arrival of Christianity as well. Um, Again, I think we talked about a little bit last time. It's very
Yeah.
hotly debated about when the Christianity arrived.
I'm
Uh,
excited to hear more about that. I thought that was awesome. So yeah, anyway, yes,
yeah,
please.
so that was the next thing on my list. So uh, this could be another reason for why there's this hidden aspect to the history. Is 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 the roots of the Brythonic Christianity. So as I said earlier, they're teaching people that Christianity came to England either in the north from Ireland or in the south from the continent. But we already had a Christianity here in the West,
Yeah.
and Ireland wouldn't have had a Christianity if it wasn't for that Brythonic Christianity. Patrick was a Briton, and he was captured. Well, so the story goes, he was captured, and then on his second visit, then he started converting people. Um,
Patrick was a Briton?
yeah,
That sounds offensive.
no, I know, all
I'm
right, and I really hope I don't upset anyone. But I
joking.
mean, it's in his life and stuff, and who his
Okay.
parents are, and some people think he's from kind of like the Middle England, some people from Wales, so it's kind of not really sure. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people get around it by saying Patrick was a Roman,
Oh, okay.
which doesn't really mean anything because I mean,
What year was Patrick?
uh, uh, so his evangelization of Ireland is somewhere between like 450 and 480 AD.
Oh, okay, okay, okay. Gotcha. Gotcha.
So, but as I say, we've got Christian memorials in the West Country that around from that time, if not before that time. Um,
So cool.
yeah. So, wait, I've upset the Irish. Who am I going to upset next?
No, you're good. I don't think so. I think we got it. Okay.
The next one is so. There's a possibility of Christianity. So we've got the tin map up here. There's a very popular phrase in, or should we say, ditty, a song, poem in Cornwall, which starts with the line, Joseph was a tin man.
Mm,
It's referring to Joseph of Arimathea.
that's so cool.
Uh, yeah, so the idea that Joseph was actually, well into the tin trade,
Well,
and
Joseph, we know he was wealthy, right?
yes, yes.
Um, and so he's he must be someone of relative importance if he can go up and talk to Pilate and negotiate things,
Hmm.
which he did if you believe the accounts and John or
Hmm.
whatever. So kind of would make sense that maybe he's involved in some kind of intercontinental tin trade. It fits. I like it. Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, it's
Cool.
certainly one way of doing it. And so yeah, so we have stories about Jesus's lost years here in Britain, and that he became and trained with the Druids.
Let's go.
Um, yeah, so that's really interesting. There's several places in Cornwall. One of them is called St. Justin Roseland. There's Bude Island as well, St. Michael's Island in Bude, um, St. Michael's Mount in West Cornwall as well. And all of these places have stories about the child Jesus arriving with Joseph. Um, as
As
I
a
say, training.
child.
Sorry?
So arriving with Joseph, not of Arimathea, but
No,
Joseph.
no, with Joseph of Arimathea. That's the suggestion is
Oh,
that he was
wow.
taken by his uncle, and that possibly Joseph. There's another suggestion as well that Joseph is not just a trader, but he is also of royal stock,
Yeah. I
and
like
that he was related to British royals as well.
Well, and there is this kind of this idea, I guess it's sort of like a not uh orthodox idea, but that Mary and Joseph and therefore Joseph of Arimathea were kind of a part of this you know, important group,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
the Essenes or whoever.
Mm.
So yeah, that's interesting. That would kind of explain their ability to travel this type of distance with ease. They must have had some connections. Okay, cool.
Yeah, and then of course, if you dig into the Ten Tribes stuff, or even just some sort of Levantine influence in the past, is there going to be some other cultural, religious, spiritual understanding that people of Israel at the time would have with the British Druids of the time? Um, how similar is their theology? Um,
Dude,
so.
I love this. This
Yeah,
is
yeah.
this
So
is so
there's
cool.
lots of interesting ideas about. So people often talk about uh, the destruction of paganism at the hands of Christianity in this country. But often what we're seeing is later medieval records and things, and I think we're looking at the persecution of a later Christianity against an early Christianity.
Oh,
There's so much more Christian on Christian violence in this country than there
so
seems to be Christian on pagan violence.
like like early Christians versus like a Romanized Christians,
Yeah, and
Catholic Christians kind of
that's
idea.
certainly where I will, will go with it.
No, cool. Christians would never argue over stuff.
Absolutely. But yeah, so there's a possibility of a first century influence of Christianity in Britain with Joseph of Arimathea, maybe even Christ himself. There's also other apostles who are said to have come here. One of them's called Aristobulus, who I think was possibly the father of Simon the Zealot. I'm not sure. I
Okay.
have to double check that. He's called Arwistli Hen in in Britain, in Wales. Um, Also, St. Philip, St. Paul, St. Peter. All of them have um, stories attached for them visiting Britain. So St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the big main cathedral in London, is called St. Paul's Hill because of a story of St. Paul preaching from there.
Wow.
Yeah, which is not something you hear often. But if you dive into history of St. Paul's, that's why that cathedral is there, because it is believed that St. Paul preached from there. Um, Moving forward, we got something around 160 AD where a British king, Lyrig, or Lucius, seemed to send a letter to Rome saying, "I want to update my Christian practices." So they're all. Then he must have had some, but he was looking for, you know, an update. I want to get in more continental and see what's
What
going on.
what year did you say? 160
What
AD?
160 AD, so right in the middle of the Roman occupation.
Well, this is pretty conclusive, right? I mean that
Yeah, but then people say, "Oh, it's just a holy fraud," or something like that.
yeah.
Yeah, I know. It just gets. There's another one actually, another first century one actually. So the biggest one of the kings to really resist the Romans was a king called Caradoc, and he's or Caractacus, as he's known in Latin, and he's famous because he held out against Rome for like 15 years. Like he did really well. I think 10 years, 10, 15 years. Anyway, a long time. He did really well. When he was eventually captured, he was taken to Rome. Now, normally, they like to immediately behead their opposition because it's the safest thing to do in their eyes. And Vercingetorix, the king of the Allied Gaul, was beheaded by Caesar or at least one of his staff pretty much straight after his defeat. Um, but Caradoc gets taken to Rome and he's allowed to speak to the Senate. And he gives such a rousing speech, and this speech is recorded, that they were like, fine, yeah, you can live. And they built
Wow.
him a villa, and him and his family lived in a villa in Rome for an undeterminate amount of period of time. And there's a suggestion that his son Linus Linus mentioned in the Bible is the first bishop of Rome,
Mm,
and that another son of his or his grandson Bran then took Christianity back to Britain with him.
okay.
Um, so that's another first century one. Um, but then when we fast forward to
I
Arthur's time,
I just gotta say, I love that idea.
yeah,
That is
you
so
can look
cool.
up Linus in the Bible and Claudia as well. It's really interesting characters because you get these really specific names found in the British text, which you can find in the Bible. And I think is it oh God, I'm sorry, I should have looked this up again. I think it's Linus, Claudia, and her husband. Is he Rufens? Something like that. But I'll see if I should I'll do a bit of research on that again, and we'll come back to that one because that's a really interesting where these things match up, basically. Um, and it seems like the Britons in first century Rome were really important in the genesis of Christianity in Rome.
I mean, when you read the history of Christian persecution in Rome, like between starting with Nero, 40 AD, all the way to Diocletian, I mean, it makes sense that right away, even in the first century, you'd be trying to get out of there if you were a
Yeah, so
Christian.
I think Claudia was martyred. Oh, damn it! I wish I'd looked this up. Um, yeah, there's a really interesting, really like one of the oldest churches in Rome is actually said to be Caradox Villa, or at least built on the remains of Caradox Villa.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
yeah, yeah, it's really cool that story. I need to look into that again, actually.
I mean,
But
but just what better place to go if there's a place that there's a culture of people knowing how to get to that's on
mhm.
the fringes of the empire. It's an island. I mean, Britain just seems like an obvious place to
Yeah,
flee
it's a
if you
great
have the
hiding place.
cultural advantage.
Absolutely, yeah,
If you have the means.
and it really did suffer at the hands of the Diocletian uh, raids as well. There seems to be, I think St. Alban as well was martyred during the Diocletian. What's the word I'm looking for? Diocletian
There's the Christian purge or
Diocletian persecution.
persecution. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, you know what I mean.
he was like 300 early 300, right? AD.
Yeah, yeah.
He was
End
right
of the
before
third, beginning
Constantine.
of the second. Yeah, something around that
So
time.
pretty much from day one, from year zero to 313 or whenever Constantine showed up,
Yeah.
people would have been looking for a place to hide. But Rome reached Britain when?
So let's say complete conquest in by like 90 AD, but
Okay.
that force started arriving about 50 AD.
So
Julius
we
Caesar failed twice in 55 BC and 54 BC.
so we almost have 100 years where you have this new religious group that's in hiding that could have
Possibly,
been
yeah.
potentially going to this place. Wow, so cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so yeah, Christianity could have. So this is really interesting when we get to the Arthurian period, because by this time the Roman Empire has fractured, and we've got a big gap in Northern Europe where the Germanic tribes have just piled in. They're starting to be Christianized. You got the Franks have been Christianized, and they're sort of moving towards uh, the Holy Roman Empire and things like that, a more again a Christianized Western Europe, which has been fractured by the Germanic tribes. But in Britain, their Christianity has developed and become more of an institution outside of Roman control, right?
Right. Yeah.
So when St. Augustine or St. Austin arrives from the continent in about it's like 597 is the year given. So this is after towards either the end of Arthur's reign or 50 years after Arthur's reign, depending on who you ask. Um, St. Austin arrives and he's there to Christianize the Saxons. The Saxons are pagans, and he goes to meet the British bishops on the banks of the Severn. The Severn is the river that separates Wales and England, and they don't want to receive him.
Hmm.
They're not interested in what he has to say at all. Um, and the inference is that he has no authority compared to the authority they have because of their primacy. Rome is a new church compared to theirs. This is like I'm reading into this and putting my own slant on it, but there is
Well,
a
you know,
the
if we're
constant idea that the British church is not impressed with the Catholics because in their opinion, they don't have any authority.
yeah, if we're following kind of this story that we're weaving, it potentially the Roman Catholic Church would be a few decades old, and or I'm not exactly sure, but the English, if quote unquote English Christianity could be 350 years old by
Yeah,
this
yeah,
time.
yeah. Or the British Christianity. Yeah, absolutely. So,
Sorry. I forget.
yeah, and
I'm still trying to learn those meanings.
no, no, absolutely. Yeah. But so in the writing, it kind of, they only ever really talk about two things majorly, and that is the calculation of the date of Easter,
Okay.
um, with the Celtic churches doing a much more older Jewish calculation or related to how the Jewish calculated various holidays and things like that. The Romans have a newer way of doing it, which is possibly better for timekeeping in the long run, but it doesn't have that tradition.
Hmm.
Um, and the other thing is the cut of the tonsure for monks. So obviously the classic Roman one is with a bald spot. The Celtic one is like kind of bald from the front back, and you just have like a strip of hair at the front.
Mm.
Um, and for me, when you see them arguing about these things, for me, I feel like that they're kind of talking in euphemisms. Like there's something much more deeper and important, like boiling underneath, but it's something that you can't. It's dodgy to, you're on the bounds of heresy writing about it, even if you're criticizing. So
What
I
do you
feel like when they're
what do you
talking
think?
to each other about the calculation and the dates of East and the tonsure and the date of Easter, that they're kind of trying to say some other things, but they just can't say it out loud.
Would you speculate or
Um, Firstly, it's to do with which church is older.
got it? Yeah.
I think
Okay.
that's part of it.
Well,
There's other things.
if you're arguing about sort of this like tradition about how monks should look and how dates should be kept, it kind of makes sense that you're trying to establish, well, we were here first.
Yes, yeah,
And
yeah,
then
we
the
have.
Romans trying to say, well, we're Rome. And so that you're kind of talking past each other. I get what you're saying. That makes sense.
Yeah. So, but then what happens after this though is so after these British bishops are not interested in greeting St. Austin, suddenly the Saxon wars with the Britons take on a bit more of a religious tone.
Mm.
So more church sites seem to be targeted. There's a
All
very
right.
famous.
Help me understand the connection there. So
So
with
in other
the,
words,
the
rather than this
Saxons were
being,
more Romanized or
should we say, what my point being that let's say the Saxons before it was about territory and resources, then it seems to come up be about religion.
but who are the Saxons? Are they're
They're
Germanic or
Catholic.
Roman? They're Roman Catholic.
Yeah, being influenced by the Roman Church. Yeah,
Got it. Okay.
they're Germanic peoples, but yeah, Austin Augustine has come from Rome in order to.
Gotcha.
uh, So there seems to be, yeah, the fighting seems to take on a bit more of a religious tone, and
Got it. Got it.
there's a battle at a place called Bangor, where there were monks, 1,000 monks watching the battle, and they were praying for the victory of the Britons, and the Saxon general saw this, and he had 1,000 monks slaughtered. Um,
Yeah, wow. Okay. So this just went from being a territorial expansion thing to we got to crush this
We've
rival.
got a religious war, yeah. And this is something that's really big for a long time. The when the Saxons get in power, they're still writing letters to some of the British kings saying your bishops aren't behaving properly. You need to do something about this. They're not doing the right thing. There could be other problems as well. So the Britons would have mixed communities, mixed monastic communities, men and women. Um, and they could marry, priests could marry. Um, and the Saxon priests and bishops thought this was absolutely awful to have women
I've
in these
got to
places.
I've got to side with the Britons on this one. It's pretty clear in the scripture that he thought not getting married was weird. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
forget
right.
I forget which book that is, but he's like, yeah, you should probably get married
Yeah, absolutely.
if you're gonna be a priest or whatever. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
cool, 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 cool.
So yeah, so there's probably what's interesting though is despite the fact that the Saxon priests were disgusted by these things, when they arrived at the British monasteries, the British priests often wouldn't let the Saxons eat with them for like 3 weeks, like for a few days before, like because they thought they would like say, oh no, we don't want you at our table. You've got to eat in your cell for 3 days, then you're allowed to come and sit and eat at our table. When
Ooh, a
you
power move.
yeah, well, after you're absolutely right. So there is this, there is for literally centuries afterwards, this constant, we want, and often this count, like the Easter calculation date, for example, wasn't accepted by certain parts of Britain or even Brittany or an Ireland for hundreds of years afterwards. It took a long time to sort of bring that church into the fold. Um, but yeah, and I think this could be another one of those things about why this um, history gets kind of obscured because the genesis of Christianity in Britain is not as simple as is often made out. There's a lot more going on.
Who does that offend though? I mean, it just seems so
I mean,
innocuous.
absolutely. And
No one's worried about offending the Catholics. Nobody cares
no, I
about
mean,
that.
I tell you what, the one of the main keepers of this is the Orthodox Church in Britain. You
Oh,
often
interesting.
find a lot of this stuff still maintained in Orthodoxy, and a lot of the what we call the Celtic saints now aren't accepted as saints in the Anglican Church because
Mm.
the Anglican Church is kind of like a Catholic copy. Or I don't know. I don't want to upset other people like that, but
Anglican just means like English Catholic, right?
yeah, it's the modern English church, right?
Okay.
That is a Protestant church separate from Rome, with a monarch at its head and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Um,
Man,
but
Christians got a real problem
yeah, right.
with splitting
But
into smaller and smaller groups. It's so funny.
yeah.
All right, sorry.
Then I was just going to say, Orthodoxy still recognizes a lot of the classic Celtic saints, which is really interesting, I think.
That's cool. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, a lot of them now are missing from Anglican Church. They call them, or they call them pre-congregational saints or something like that. Um, but
Honorable mention. I get it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of them are still the dedicatees of church buildings, so you can't completely ignore them. They're
Well,
like resident saints.
that is fascinating. Okay. So help me with time period again. So
Cool.
when we're talking about this turn where this war picks on like a religious fervor, that would have been
So that's
400, 500.
yeah, that's 600. So Augustine arrives in 597. Now this is kind of like spurred along by the text. So we've only got one 6th century uh, text surviving from Britain, and it's this one, and it's by a guy called Gildas, and it's
Okay.
called the Ruin or Saint Gildas, I should say, the Ruin and Conquest of Britain. That's his name in English. A lot of people call it De Excidio. Now, it's a very controversial piece because it, one, it's a medieval text, so medieval texts are ripe for different readings and different understandings. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, it's annoying because it's right slap bang in the Arthurian period, and he doesn't mention Arthur. So this is a big win for those people who don't think Arthur is a real person.
And where
It's
was this individual located?
Gildas. He was definitely writing in Western Britain. He is a Briton, but where exactly is a good question. There's still
Okay.
arguments about where he was from.
But
Um,
he should have been aware of Arthur.
Yes, there's a possibility he was writing after Arthur died. There's also stories about how Arthur killed Gildas's brother.
Yeah,
So
because medieval could go all the way into what,
yeah, it's
1300?
like 1,000 years medieval.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Early medieval is specifically what we're talking about. But
Okay.
yeah, so yeah, Gildas doesn't mention Arthur, which is a bit annoying, but he does mention Ambrosius Aurelianus, um, who is Arthur's uncle in Geoffrey of Monmouth's text.
Okay.
Some people get this idea that Ambrosius is Arthur because
Okay.
of a certain reading of Gildas, which I don't think is a very good reading personally. Basically, Gildas says Aurelius took command of the Britons, had some successes. Then he says some time passed, and then he says it was the Battle of Badon. And the Battle of Badon is very famously Arthur's big victory against the Saxons. So some people take that to mean Ambrosius Aurelianus was the leader at Badon.
Okay. So he's actually writing about Arthurian events and doesn't mention Arthur.
Oh, yes. In fact, some of the people that he mentions are in the text are very closely linked to
Huh.
Arthurian law.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, there's all sorts of political reasons why that could happen, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. But the problem with Gildas is that he was a churchman, and that text is it's it's full of religious polemic. It's a what's the word I'm looking for?
When you say he was a churchman, a Roman churchman?
Yeah, and no, he was a Britain churchman, although there's definitely this is a very contentious issue on how much influence and also how much certain individuals felt about things. So although he is a Brythonic churchman, he may have had certain sympathies towards Roman Church,
Okay.
you know?
Because that could
They,
potentially
these
be a
saints these
reason
saints
to
were
leave
definitely
Arthur out.
yeah, and these saints are definitely traveling to the Mediterranean, to Rome and to Middle East as well.
Got it.
Right? And I have no doubt about that. Yeah, but he's writing this piece of religious polemic. So it's a what's the word? Oh God, I still can't think of the word. What does the vicar do when a priest gets up and does his bit in front of the
A sermon?
sermon? Yeah, it's essentially a sermon because sermons were acted like political propaganda for a long time because
Did
it
you
was a
say,
place where you
did you
had lots
say
of people
vicar?
together.
What's the word you used?
Vicar, that's a very Anglican church word.
Okay. I'm like, what does that mean?
It's a
I can tell
priest.
by
This is an
context.
Anglican
Okay.
priest.
Okay. Gotcha. Gotcha.
Yeah,
All right.
but I wonder where it comes from. I'm gonna have to look at the etymology of that. Um, yeah, so yeah, he's given his sermon, and yeah, it's a piece of propaganda essentially. So although there are historic elements in it, he talks about a period from he talks about the Romans being in Britain, and he leads it right up to his day. But he's not trying to faithfully record history. He is
Right.
trying to make a point, right?
Most
Um,
people writing are trying to make a point. And especially
Absolutely.
if he's writing like 20 or 30 years after Arthur or even more, it's like a perfect opportunity to spin a narrative, right?
Absolutely. So Gildas's text is also at the heart of this how violent the argument that's raging in history and archaeology here at the moment is how violent was the Saxon conquests? Because if you read Gildas, it sounds like a terrible, bloody conquest from east to west, pushing everyone aside, massacring everyone, and destroying everything. Now, I think that's a very, very simplistic reading of Gildas, like bare bones. If you
Okay.
if you take on the fact that he's trying to write for political reasons and kind of read it a bit more sensibly, I think he talks about a period of, yes, there were periods of violence, and sometimes these were extreme and unpleasant, but also there would have been periods of peace, in inverted commas, of just trade and cultural spread. And there certainly seems to be, that's what the archaeological evidence shows. We get people in Saxon dress, in with Saxon goods, in a Saxon burial, um, and they'll have Brythonic DNA,
Oh, wow.
right? In fact, the Wessex people, who are sort of the Western Saxons, took the primacy and eventually spread out to become all of England, essentially. That's a very quick way of putting it, but there's not a lot of Brythonic DNA. Sorry, not a lot of Saxon DNA in the Wessex people from this period. You don't find it very much at all. Most Saxon DNA is all in the east of the country. Um, so there was definitely elements of subcultural spread, but say Gildas kind of paints it to be a lot worse. But his point is essentially that the kings of the Britons are falling into moral disruin, infighting, various unchristian behavior. They didn't try to convert the Saxons, and so the Saxons are a punishment from God to destroy the Britons. That is Gildas's argument.
Classic.
Right. Okay. So, unsurprisingly, a couple of centuries later, an English historian called Bede picks up on this, and Bede was held as like a kind of a standard for a long time for medieval history. Um, but the guy's an out and out racist, to be honest. His work is full of like awful things said about the Britons, like just it's just ridiculous. But he really picks up on Gildas's narrative of being, this punishment of God, from God of the Britons. Um, uh, and Bede also doesn't mention Arthur, which is another issue.
Hmm.
But we do
It
have.
does it does
Sorry, go
kind
on.
of sound like they have an agenda,
Hmm.
right? It sounds like they're pushing a narrative. Would you speculate as to the motivation? Is it some type of political church thing? They're trying to move their church closer to the Roman
Yeah,
church or
yeah,
something? Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I think that Bede's point, I think, is that now it's time to for the Britons to give up the religious control. This is the history of our religious influence. He's Gildas does set up a bit for how Christianity developed in Britain, not in so many words, but he does hint at that, and I think it shows some of the Christian tradition in Britain, and I think Bede wanted to do that as well, but for England. He
Mm,
wanted to create the Saxon history of Christianity. And why that's now should be the prominent and the main one. Um,
gosh, the whole idea of like the Saxons are the punishment for that crime. It's like such an Old Testament idea, you know? It's just
yeah,
like
and
not,
the book is full of biblical quotes. I mean, it's
yeah.
virtually like 30% of his piece is biblical quotes. Um, the curious thing, so I one of these arguments we touched on last time, I think, that the idea that at one point in time, especially in let's say the 50s to the 70s, they there was a quite a popular idea that Arthur probably was a historical medieval king, but it was probably just a regional king whose story got blown out of proportion. The idea being that Britain was lots of fractured separate states at the time.
Right.
They didn't have this sort of cohesive nature. There was no high king. This is just a small story that's been blown out of proportion. But but Gildas's point, he addresses five kings by name for their irreligious behavior, and he says lots of nasty things about them. But the whole cut and thrust of his work, and there's a very famous Arthurian writer called John Morris who made this point. I thought this was my original observation, but John Morris got there first.
I hate when
Is
that
that
happens. Yep.
he is saying that for Gildas, the the infighting, the fractured, fragmented Britain is the exception because he's harking back to the past and talking about the Golden Age, the United Britain in the past when they were successful and religious and united.
Oh,
And now you've got these infighting kings who are, raping and killing and, killing each other's kids and marrying wives and then killing their wives off and marrying another wife and all this sort of stuff.
so
And
even the individual kind of writing the story without Arthur in it, even he is acknowledging that there used to be this age of harmony and golden age.
Absolutely, absolutely,
Okay.
and he gives the title of Dux Bellorum, I believe, to Ambrosius Aurelianus, and Dux Bellorum is also in Nennius associated with Arthur, and it basically means like leader of battles.
Mhm.
The implication, some people think it means uh, it's sort of like an elect. You have separate kingdoms, but when in times of trouble they come together and elect a single leader who
Yeah.
becomes, you know,
A
leads the
general
united forces.
of the army.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Combined.
Ambrosius Aurelianus and in Geoffrey, his brother Uther Pendragon as well, are fighting against Vortigern. And Vortigern is the British king who invited the Saxons over. And, they regularly say about Vortigern, he is High King of the island. So we have Vortigern who's High King, Ambrosius who becomes High King. So why can't then immediately following, can there not be Arthur who's High King before then this fracturing and infighting that we see in Gildas?
Wow.
Yeah. It's
God, I want
very
to know. I want to know. I want you to tell me. Tell me, Peter. Why? Why? What is it about
and I
Arthur
mean,
that? Yeah.
yeah, this is one of the compelling things about Arthur as well, is that in the middle of the in the middle of the sixth century, the Saxon success westward just kind of stops for a bit.
Hmm.
It just 20-25 years of peace. And Gildas is talking about the 20 years of peace that follows the Battle of Badon.
Oh, wow.
He was like, and I know this because I was born in the same year as Badon. And he's like, and now things are a bit of a shit state, you know.
Wow, but
But
he
it's
doesn't use his name for some reason. So
huh?
does he say who the king is at the time at that battle?
No, he doesn't, and that's the problem. That's
That's
why some
odd.
people infer that Ambrosius sort of
That's what you mentioned
inferred.
earlier. Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's not that he is saying, "Oh, King." I'm just using this name. It's obviously a stupid name, but King John is the king, not Arthur. He's
Yeah.
just acting like there is no king. He's just not even addressing the fact that a king exists during
Well,
this
yeah, I
time.
mean, part of it could be because in his time, if you say the Battle of Badon, then you wouldn't need to specify. That's one way I look at it. That in
Or
his
or it's politically risky to talk about
or it's
Arthur.
politically, he talks about, so one of the kings named is a king called Maelgwn Gwynedd, who's very interesting. He's sometimes called the biggest man in Britain. Maelgwn here, Maelgwn the Tall, big bloke.
Nice.
But Maelgwn is the most powerful. Gilda says he's the most powerful king that he names, but he also says that he is almost the most powerful king in Britain.
Oh, come on. That's as good as
Yeah,
it
right.
gets.
So it's like, well, who's the most powerful? I mean, Gildas could have been talking about a Saxon king by then. Maybe there was a Mercian king who had already become more
Sure.
powerful.
But I
But
mean, one interpretation of that, it almost makes it sound like he's not trying to spin a narrative. He's like alluding to, we all know who we're talking about.
yeah, yeah. The
I
other
just
thing
can't
is,
say it.
yeah, the other thing is that why does Gildas? What security does Gildas have to trash the five most powerful men in Britain?
Right, right.
You know
Yeah.
what? Where is he writing from where he thinks he can get away with that?
Oh,
Um,
good point. Yeah.
I think it's just because he's deeply involved in the royal religious clan. He's very probably closely related to some of these people, and maybe because he's writing from the court of King Arthur. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah.
That's just one option. I tend towards to think this is after Arthur died because both Maelgwn Gwynedd is named as a fairly immediate successor to Arthur in some texts, and another king, Constantine of Damnonia, that's this region here, Damnonia. Constantine is named as a successor to Arthur in Geoffrey of Monmouth.
Okay.
So this seems to be either towards the end or after Arthur's death. For me personally, other people have lots of different views on that. Um,
Well, that's interesting. That's pretty. I think we don't really have a good understanding of what books were in 500, 600 AD,
no.
because now book, like if you sit down and write a book, you might have an agenda, but you're trying to present anything you write can be fact checked. it's not necessarily going to be political. Politics are on TV, politics are on social media. I mean, you could write a
Mm.
political book, but back then a book was all of those things. You know,
Yeah,
it was the news, it was politics, it was religion. It was like this was the only way people had
entertainment.
of preserving ideas. So like it is so difficult to read into motives, I feel like with books back then, but I think the one
Absolutely.
you put forward makes a lot of sense. So
And I
um
think just one more thing about Gildas before we do whatever we do, and that is that one thing his text shows as well is that he has a very excellent grasp of Latin rhetoric. It's very well written, so it shows, in my mind, it shows how much has been lost because he's just one person writing from one religious establishment from a country of hundreds of religious establishments with hundreds of writers in. This book would not have been the only thing this person wrote. You know, he's an accomplished writer. And as I say, he is just but one man. Yet that is the only text that we have surviving.
hmm.
And there must have been thousands. There must have been. You don't, things like that don't, texts like that don't come out of a vacuum.
Are you suggesting like a systematic?
Destruction, possibly.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
possibly. I mean, also there is just the march of time, and we live in a
Mhm.
very damp country, and paper does not last long,
Right. Yeah.
especially in stone buildings, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that could be an issue as well. But some people have remarked upon how well it suits Saxon propaganda that the one text to survive from Britain at that time is Gildas, which is not a particularly nice patriotic text for the Britons.
Yeah, it is a little convenient. And, you know, this idea that throughout history, everyone's just trying to preserve the truth. And, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
it's like, no, there's everyone's trying to push a certain narrative forward. So,
Mm.
uh, speaking of certain narratives, well, first of all, I think maybe we can leave the people wanting more and start wrapping
Yeah,
up.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah,
Um, Speaking of narratives, I don't know if you expressly gave me permission to bring this up, but I think I can. But I think anyone listening to this is thinking like, man, Peter should write a book because this stuff is fascinating. And I do, listening to you, I do feel like the sense of a grander narrative. Like I would just love to start at year 1600 BC and just go through the millennia, you know, like it is it's super cool. I love it. I think that this is an amazingly interesting story. So you are writing that book. And
absolutely. And I think we what I hope to be doing with you and in the last one is trying to build up a bit of a context because unfortunately I'm not writing a narrative from 1600 BC
right.
onwards.
Well,
And we're
that
looking very specifically at the Arthurian period. And
there's not a
what I hope
scroll long enough for that story. Yeah,
yeah. So I'm hoping with the next one we can dive into some Arthurian characters and possibly look at the way that I've been looking at them myself. Um, so we can start to see the the structure and the what's the word I'm looking for? So the how power and religion may have been geographically distributed in the Arthurian period and how we can look at that historical context and possibly say once and for all that there was an Arthur who ruled a very large portion of Britain, and he isn't just some local king and isn't just a myth of prehistory either.
that's awesome. Well, unlike our listeners, I'm lucky enough that I get to read your writing as you write it because you're fortunate, you're generous enough to share it with me. I will plug our Substack here,
Oh yeah.
hemisphericpress.substack.com. You can just go to hemisphericpress.com. There's links there. Um, yeah, Peter's going to start posting some more of his work and information on that website if folks want to check that out. There is going to be a code coming out when my Brothers of the Serpent interview comes out that gives people the first year free. So if people want to wait a bit and sign up and get the first year free, you can do that. And yeah, I think we'll wrap up there. Peter's going to be doing another big show here soon that you guys will all recognize. So if you liked this stuff, don't worry. There's going to be more episodes with Peter coming out on other podcasts very soon. Peter, what do you want to close with, my friend?
Uh, we'll do. I think we skirted around Arthur a lot today. So if people have tuned in for Arthur, I'm really sorry. But we will
I'll adjust the
definitely.
title. I'll adjust
In
the title
fact,
accordingly.
what we'll do is next time we'll dive straight into Uther Pendragon.
Yes. Okay.
All right,
Yeah,
because he's
no, we did.
fascinating.
We skirted Arthur, but this is important because I feel like this is not a story you can tell without the context. Like
Yeah,
the
yeah.
history and the geography of this place is so complicated. The peoples to just jump into Arthur, you basically it'd be like watching Sword in the Stone on Disney. You just wouldn't have any
Yeah,
clue
it's kind
what's going
yeah,
on.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
So I think that's great. Thanks everybody for listening. Thank you, Peter. Please
Thank you.
give us an email at happyfoolspodcast.com. Buy my book and subscribe to our Substack so you can buy Peter's book. Thanks, Peter.
Cheers. Thank you.